Well, thanks very much, Mark. I'd forgotten a bit about some of that history, so you obviously did a bit of homework there. Look, it is a pleasure to be with you all today. This is the Victorian home of the Fourth Estate. I've had a long history of dealing with the media in many guises and always enjoy that interaction very much. Now, the ACCC and the media often have a very common label. The notion of the Fourth Estate rests on the idea that the media's function is to act as a guardian or watchdog of the public interest. And I think in that sense the ACCC is also a guardian of the public interest. We both have our critics, both the media and the ACCC, but equally we play our part in checking various imbalances or excesses in our society. With this point in mind, as I've stated many times, I'm a strong believer, very strong believer in the benefits of a market economy. I've also said, however, that the ACCC's role in realising those benefits is absolutely pivotal. The profit motive works for the good of the community, but only when there's adequate competition and effective regulation. Without these, the profit motive can lead to consumer detriment. For me, the ACCC's core role is to protect and enhance the long-term interests of consumers. This doesn't mean holding down prices or pressing for low rates of return to inhibit investment. It does mean ensuring that we have strongly competitive markets wherever possible and providing effective regulation where it's not possible. Regulation is second best, but it's necessary in many circumstances where you can't have effective competition. So the two very much go hand in glove. Today, I want to expand on three particular points. First, I want to explain how the ACCC will best fulfil its mandate if it's strategic, if we sometimes take on cases where the outcome may be less predictable, and if on occasion we advocate for policy change. This approach recognises that the ACCC operates, thankfully, in a world where governments, the courts and also the media play a key role. My second point today is that while the Act works to protect the degree of competition that already exists, I want to discuss how we need to ensure that competition is effective and extended to more areas of the economy. Finally, and equally important, I want to talk about how, when we're settling regulatory arrangements, we've got to make sure that there's a larger role for the users of those infrastructure in engaging in the debate where we go about settling the access arrangements. And I think it's a very important point. So now let me elaborate on each of the 3 points, and please, as you get your meal, feel free to dive in and eat. I'm used to talking over knives and forks, that's not a problem. So, turning to how the ACCC can best fulfil its mandate. At its heart, the ACCC is an enforcement agency. To be fully effective, we need to be strategic, that is, pick the cases we take on. We need to sometimes take on cases where the outcome may be less predictable, and occasionally we need to advocate for policy change. Let me explain what I mean. An effective enforcement strategy, as with any strategy, is about the choices we make. We don't have, nor should we have, endless resources. We can't investigate everything. Necessarily, the ACCC is reactive in that we take action where we see people contravening the Act. We must, however, also act strategically in deciding in which areas of the economy to focus and over what time frame. That requires us to ask, where is the largest consumer detriment and where do existing market structures or mechanisms need most support? I've already identified publicly particular issues in telecommunications where we will be paying attention, and we've already had success in mobile premium services. I've mentioned energy, particularly price comparison services and door-to-door selling, which is another area where I think we need to focus. As Mark mentioned, the online retail marketplace is going to have to be an increasing focus for us. And I've also said, and I'll come back to this, in making strategic choices, the ACCC will need to take a close interest in the many oligopolistic markets in Australia. The ACCC will, of course, also continue its interest in cartel conduct. Now let me explain what I mean by the need for the ACCC to take on cases where the outcome may be less predictable. I've explained elsewhere that we have a success rate with first instance litigation at almost 100%, which I think can be seen as too conservative. Now I'm sure most of you are thinking that with the Metcash and Google decisions that I've already done my bit to change those statistics. What I want to do though is let me just point out what I wasn't saying when I was talking about taking on more cases where the outcome may be less predictable. I certainly did not intend to say that we'll take on a lot of marginal cases hoping that we'll get up on them in some sort of game of chance. I also didn't mean that we'll turn companies into guinea pigs. After all, as a Commonwealth agency, we have to and will behave as a model litigant. What I did mean is that the ACCC will back its judgment. If we see serious contraventions of the law, then we'll seek to enforce the law. If there's uncertainty as to how the law operates, we won't shy away from our view of the law and its application. If this requires arguing the case before a court, the ACCC will pursue it so that the law is clarified in those very important areas. There's been a couple of recent examples which I think, even though started before my time, illustrate that approach. You may be aware of the action we took against Google for misleading and deceptive conduct. The issue was the way in which Google characterised the advertised content in its search results and how its functions diverted users through a search term to another site, sometimes that of a competitor company to that which was initially typed in. Now, we didn't win the case in the federal court, but there is no question that the law in this area does need clarification. I should also add that since the court case, there's been a worldwide change in some of Google's practices, and I think the ACCC can take some credit for that. Another recent example was a Queensland case, known as the Willems case. This concerned a form of bid ringing in the construction industry. It involved a thing called cover pricing, which is apparently a long-standing practice among many builders, which manipulated the tender process and was a form of cartel activity. We took the view that there was a clear breach of the law, but the builders strongly contested it. Now, in this case, the federal court found in our favour and made it clear that this practice was unlawful. Looking forward, let me turn my attention to the many oligopolistic markets in Australia. In this context, of course, most people's thoughts turn to the grocery sector. There have been some positive developments in the grocery sector. For example, Coles are now actively challenging Woolworths, as we continually hear, through the issue of price discounting. And we have some relatively new entrants in Aldi and Costco, alongside, of course, the well-established independents. Inhibiting these new entrants and the existing independents has been at least two factors which the ACCC has sought to address. First, restrictive covenants written into leases that major shopping centres had with the major supermarkets had with the shopping centres. These were a hurdle, effectively preventing centre managers leasing space to competing supermarkets. The ACCC now has court-enforceable undertakings from the major grocery retailers to phase out any existing provisions and to stop any new leases containing these restrictive covenants. Another area where the smaller players struggle is getting access to suitable sites. The ACCC now closely examines all site acquisitions for major supermarkets under merger laws. But let's be clear, the two supermarkets still do have significant market power. For example, many smaller suppliers to the supermarkets feel they lack a real ability to negotiate supply arrangements. The ACCC can and will be watching closely to ensure that any such dealings do not involve unconscionable conduct by the supermarkets. Another example is the supermarkets sell both branded and their own private label products. This vertical integration in the supply chain needs close scrutiny to ensure the supermarkets do not misuse their market power under Section 46 of the Act. It may be that when we take on cases in a general sense, I'm now moving off supermarkets, and gain clarification by the courts, we will then see issues that require a policy or legislative response. If so, we will advocate such a response. However, as I have said previously, we'll do so understanding that we're one voice among many. In the next 5 years, you will not hear me criticise the courts, the government of the day, or the parliament. All these institutions have legitimate roles, and these must be respected. The government of the day and the parliament establish the law. The ACCC enforces it, often by taking cases to the court. And the courts decide. We may sometimes appeal the decision, but the courts rightly have the final say. That's all a classic example of a particular separation of powers. We all have our job to do. Our job is to decide which cases to take on, sometimes to appeal, occasionally to advocate policy change. And so in that sense, you can see the process is rather self-reinforcing. We learn as we go. The media, of course, has a crucial role to play. Journalists report on our efforts and the court outcomes, occasionally applauding, often criticising, and I'm quite happy with that. Of course, I suppose there are times when I wish the media wouldn't report the outcome of court cases as if it was the outcome of the AFL Grand Final. Let me turn to my second point, and I'll deal with this reasonably briefly, and that is try to extend competition policy into new areas. Whenever I turn to this topic, I'm reminded of an account of a conversation that took place between a treasurer and a national leader. The treasurer was setting out for the leader how the planned reforms to public service recruitment would be decided on merit. The somewhat perplexed national leader, wondering where public exams fitted into the picture of public service recruitment, turned to the treasurer and asked, "Where is this principle of competition ever to end?" The leader was Queen Victoria, the treasurer was William Gladstone, and the conversation took place in 1853. This simply serves to remind us how long we've been going down the competition policy road, at least 160 years apparently, and let's hope the journey doesn't end. Fred Hilmer, who Mark mentioned, an old friend of mine now, has given us a modern perspective on some of this. Fred, of course, was responsible for the Hilmer report in the early 90s. That report provided the blueprint, which, among other things, led to the formation of the ACCC as the merger of the Prices Surveillance Authority and the Trade Practices Commission. But very recently, Fred has argued that Australia has seen declining national productivity since the early 2000s. He then argued that our productivity depends on two factors. The first is what Fred calls enablers. By that he meant a more skilled workforce, more spending on infrastructure, basically the supply side of the equation. These are the enablers. The second factor, though, which Fred said was much more important, is incentives. And the main one he had in mind was competition policy. As Fred argued, the balance in Australian policy reform may have tipped too far towards the enablers and not enough in terms of the incentives. Yet incentives, as I've said, are the more powerful lever to achieve productivity growth. Indeed, Fred felt that this shift away from a focus on competition may have contributed to our recent poor productivity performance. A challenge the ACCC faces, and one which we will embrace, is to keep the competition policy torch burning and continue the pressure for improved competition and incentives. Indeed, whenever people are talking about reforms, microeconomic reform of any sort, we need to ask, what are you doing to improve incentives? What are you doing to improve competition and extend its reach? Let me give some examples. In the infrastructure sector alone, infrastructure, of course, being an area where there's already been a lot done. But in infrastructure, we can still ask, have we got the right incentives for road use? Are the pricing signals sufficient to drive appropriate road-rail investment choices? Can more public services, such as road maintenance, be put to competitive tender? More controversially, is it sensible to introduce competition into urban water supply? Are there sufficient incentives for demand management in electricity? I would argue not. And most importantly, are the incentives faced by publicly owned energy, water and transport companies better than those that would be faced by well-regulated private sector entities? And again, I think that's a question we need to ask more and more. Now, sound competition policy provides benefits for consumers and society overall. Prices are subject to competitive restraint. Investment is contributed according to demand, and parties in commercial agreements reach fair deals. Under my chairmanship, I intend the ACCC will sometimes be a noisy proponent of this particular view. We are the major federal government agency with the word competition in our title, and so I believe it's part of our job. This leads me to my final section of my address to you today. When competition is not possible, that's when we need to talk about effective regulation. And so what I want to talk about briefly in my final part of my address is the ways we can give the users of infrastructure a better voice in settling infrastructure arrangements. Now, one of the major questions that I think the ACCC and all other regulators in Australia and possibly around the world face is ensuring that our regulation provides systemic ways in which consumers and bottleneck infrastructure users can have their voices heard in shaping regulatory outcomes. This will be uppermost in our minds as we regulate, for example, the National Broadband Network, and as we regulate the transition to the NBN. In the transition to the NBN, of course, Telstra will remain the national supplier of services through its copper network. The interim equivalence and transparency arrangements that Telstra will need to put in place as part of its structural separation undertaking are pivotal. Indeed, we, the ACCC, cannot accept a structural separation undertaking unless we're satisfied that the interim equivalence arrangements are appropriate, effective and will remain so over time. The various access seekers, such as Optus, iiNet, AAPT, will continue to rely on Telstra's copper network to supply their voice and data services. During the transition to the NBN, it's crucial that we have a level playing field so that we don't have a distorted competitive landscape as the NBN is rolled out. That will in many ways defeat its objective. The ACCC and industry have openly pointed to a number of significant shortcomings in Telstra's proposed structural separation undertaking. As we address these shortcomings, we will be using a process that gives all parties, Telstra and the access seekers, a voice in settling the equivalence and transparency arrangements. And this is an important point. Only this way can we be sure that the arrangements we put in place deliver effective equivalence of outcomes. The same approach will be taken in regulating the NBN itself. The NBN will be national, wholesale-only network. The extensive fibre to the premises infrastructure will be a fixed-line monopoly for the supply of input services to telecommunications companies who in turn will provide the relevant services to consumers. We've raised concerns with NBN Co about access to its services. A particular issue is that NBN's wholesale broadband agreement potentially allows for only limited ACCC oversight of its terms and conditions, including prices. It's absolutely necessary that there is a robust regulatory regime in place to address the potential for excessive prices and to ensure fair access to the monopoly network. We've therefore said that we expect NBN Co will structure its access arrangements and in particular its wholesale broadband agreement and special access undertaking to allow for regulated outcomes as they prove necessary. We intend to engage constructively with the NBN, its access seekers and consumers as we settle these regulatory arrangements. This will allow a robust regulatory arrangement which will see continuing reductions in prices and improvements to service quality. On another front, and I was just talking to Jeff about down here, is the subject of the regulation of airports and the subject and the Productivity Commission review into the regulation of airports. There is considerable concern that the major airports operate as monopolists in their markets. The PC's draft report into the economic regulation of airport services has found that 5 airports, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth, have sufficient power to be of policy concern. The ACCC agrees. It is Australian consumers who will ultimately pay for the monopoly rents. The exercise of market power by airports can result in inefficiency and losses in related markets such as aviation and tourism. The ACCC has a monitoring regime in place, but that does not constrain the exercise of market power. Unfortunately, we also consider that it's unlikely that the monitoring and inquiry regime proposed by the Productivity Commission's draft will provide the real answer. We think it's important that an effective solution is put in place. Such a result could be achieved by trying to address the imbalance in the bargaining power of the parties. To do this, the ACCC has proposed an approach to encourage true commercial negotiations between airports and their users, free of the use of market power. To do this, we recommend the airports be deemed declared under Part 3A of the Act, so that when airport users are negotiating with the airports, they can have access to an outcome arbitrated by the ACCC if required. We believe this will so strengthen the arm of users that arbitration will really be required. In another sector, wheat exporting facilities, we take a similar approach. Wheat is among Australia's largest agricultural exports. The arrangements for exporters' access to facilities makes a difference to our international trade. Last month, the ACCC approved arrangements for access to wheat port terminals on the East Coast and also in South Australia and Western Australia. We approved stronger regulation in South Australia and Western Australia because we recognise there's less competition than there is on the East Coast. Now, the government has recently accepted a Productivity Commission recommendation that from 2014, vertically integrated bulk handlers, that is those who run the ports but also are wheat traders, will no longer submit undertakings that govern third-party access to their port facilities. This is conditional upon port operators developing a voluntary industry code of conduct. Now, we support the liberalisation of wheat markets, we always have. However, we're concerned that in regard to export ports, there won't be sufficient competition to constrain the market power arising from the ownership of this bottleneck infrastructure by people who have interests in the upstream markets. We need to be very careful that we don't move away too quickly from the current arrangements before we're confident that there are sufficient checks and balances in place. A possible solution, similar to the case with the airports, is a declaration arbitration option available under the Competition and Consumer Act. And again, hopefully before we get to the point of needing to do that arbitration, the various entities can strike their own agreements. The above are all examples where users and consumers need to be involved in settling the regulatory arrangements. The ACCC is going to do its best to ensure that users and consumers are involved in settling the regulatory arrangements in communications. And we just hope that in the case of airports and wheat port facilities, that the users also get involved in the debate. So look, in closing, I've talked a bit about the strategy under which the ACCC will perform its role as an enforcer and a litigator. I've also talked about the importance of bringing competition to new areas of the economy, and I've also explained the importance of involving access seekers and consumers in our regulatory arrangement. So thank you for your attention today. And now I think we're open to questions.
Yes. So this is working? Yep.
It is, I think. Yeah.
Good. Rod's agreed to take questions for about 20 minutes. A couple of ground rules. Please use one of the mics that's circulating, and please identify yourself before you ask your question. And if we could begin with working journalist.
Very good.
Mr. Sim. Hello, is that on?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear the feedback. Jeff Waters from the ABC, thank you for taking my question. Can you understand how members of the public might be disappointed with what you're saying about the need for the access to airport car parking being fixed, if you like, by use of arbitration under the Act, when obviously that will only pertain to companies who are running shuttle buses to the airport, as opposed to individual members of the public who at the moment feel put out by the price of parking at the airports. Surely you don't propose for members of the public to be involved in this arbitration. Maybe you do, and if so, I'd like to hear that. But otherwise, what advice would you give to members of the public who feel put out by this?
Well, look, I would ask them to any extent they can, get behind the solutions we're proposing to put forward, or we are putting forward. We have in mind, in terms of landside access to the airports, is that the airports have to, are required to put in an undertaking that we have to approve that will dictate how that access is provided. So that can range from anything from allowing, as you mentioned, on the one hand, an off-site airport to operate, an off-site car park to operate effectively by getting buses in and out of the airport in a very efficient way, so that it does become a competitor to the airport's own car parking. At the moment, sometimes it's difficult to get the buses in. It's expensive to get the buses in because the airports control that, as it were, unilaterally. But look, there may also be airports where the airports are required to make land available for alternative car parks on the airport. So our job, what we're trying to do, is allow there to be competition for what the airport actually provides, and we're not really putting any restraints around what would be in that access undertaking, but we think that's a much more effective thing than simply price controlling the car parks, which I think is quite difficult. We think if we could get effective competition, then the airports wouldn't be able to set the prices as they do now in an unconstrained way.
Thanks. Lucy Battersby from the Age newspaper. I was wondering if you could give the business community a bit of a hint about your style as chairman. For example, are you going to be a negotiator or a procedure-driven when you're doing decisions? And secondly, could you give us an update on the decision process for the Foxtel-Ozstar merger and maybe a hint of what the hold-up is?
Okay. The second one's an easier question to answer than the first one, I think. Look, I do think procedure's good. I mean, I think the ACCC is, as I say, an enforcement agency. It has to do things in certain ways. Certain procedures have to be followed, evidence has to be gathered. So I really don't want to get into the business of making comparisons, but I don't really see myself in a smoke-filled room at the end of the day negotiating agreements. I see myself enforcing the Act, and I think the trick is the judgments about which cases you take on, which you don't, how you bring those together. I think the role of the chairman is to bring a strategic focus, work out where we should be focusing, have a big say in where the biggest consumer detriment is. Yes, keep a good eye on the processes that we're following so we don't get too bogged down, but that's about as good a description as I can give you on my approach. Foxtel-Ozstar, look, the trouble with all these things is that Foxtel-Ozstar, of course, gave us a massive amount of information because they felt very strongly that their merger is appropriate. They've given us a lot of information. We've had follow-up questions, which has led to even more information. So we're going through that information now, and of course it's only, a week ago or so that we got all the submissions in from other parties. I could be confused with other processes, but it hasn't been long since we've got the submissions from the other players. So unfortunately for these things, they are very information intensive, and you have to give it due respect, and it does take time. I mean, it is frustrating for everybody. I think the process will start to pick up now, but I'm afraid that's the reason for the delay up till now.
Bob Kersley from Business Essentials, Mr. Sims. On a subject you didn't touch on, petrol prices, are you comfortable that the ACCC has done all it can to monitor, investigate, perhaps control petrol prices? And if so, are you happy that the public is convinced of that?
I think in answer to your second question, I don't think the public is convinced of that. In answer to your first question, under the heading of being strategic, that's an area I'm taking a close look at. I've been in the job 2 months. I've got my mind around a number of sectors and a number of things. The honest answer is I'm still taking a close look at that sector, and probably will have more to say about that over the coming period. I don't want to even put a time frame on it, but it's work in progress for me.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ward from SP Alternate. Rod, thanks for that. You mentioned very briefly in infrastructure getting the incentives right for demand-side management in electricity. Could you shed a little bit more light on that, please?
Yes, look, when demand-side management was first talked about, it was very much something people thought electricity retailers would do to help them manage their obligations. They often have to sell electricity to people. The electricity usage goes up and down all the time, yet they have to make sure that they've got the supply to match the demand. People thought that demand management would be used by retailers. What's happened is that retailers have mainly solved that problem by getting access to peaking generation, which I think is the right thing for them to do. What I think we don't have is very good incentives for the distribution companies to look after their demand management. And that's, I think, a problem of the way it's regulated, not a problem of anything to do with the distribution companies. So I think that's an area that could be, I mean, it's a complex area. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I've got the solution, but partly what's driving electricity is the increasing peakiness of our demand. And of course, you've got to have the network in place to cover the maximum usage of the electricity. So if the peak demand's rising faster than the average demand, then it's costing you more in network costs to supply electricity to each of your homes. So it's important we look at it. I think there need to be better incentives, but I accept it's a complex topic, much examined. But I think it could do with a lot more examination.
Okay, anyone in the room welcome to ask a question? Even two.
Sorry, Lucy Battersby with another follow-up. Could you just give us an idea of some of the other areas that you're planning to focus on? You said you were going to be more strategic.
Now, that's one I'm going to cheat on. You can ask the question, I can answer it the way I want, I'm afraid. I'm going to be rolling those out over time as we look at them. Just as I'm looking at petrol, I'm looking at a range of other areas, and as they bubble to the surface, I'll be saying more about them, but still looking at the moment, still thinking. But good question.
Andrew Conway from the Institute of Public Accountants. Rod, perhaps following on from that question, the vast majority of our members work in and with small business, and to that end I'd be interested in your reflections on, over the term of your chairmanship, what you'd be like, how you view small business and what sort of work you'll be doing with them to assist them in the course of your chairmanship and beyond, perhaps.
Well, I don't know about beyond, I've only got here. I think one of the main things I'd like to bring to small business is just an understanding that small businesses are small and that the various requirements that people put on them are very, very difficult. We often talk about regulatory burdens on business, and it's often big business that's talking about those regulatory burdens, and you go to some very large company with thousands of employees and you ask them, you know, what's the cost of this particular onerous regulation? And they say, well, I'm employing one whole extra person on that. Well, for a big company, that's nothing. But for small companies, it matters a lot. So I think just being aware of the burdens and what small businesses can and can't do is one thing. I think separately, treating small business also as consumers. They are people who are very much on the receiving end of what happens with communications, electricity, airports even, but treating them as consumers so that they're they're part of the group of people that we've got our eye on who we're trying to help. Obviously, we'll be sometimes taking enforcement action as well, so they'll be on the receiving end, but I think just understanding that they're also consumers and that they don't have endless resources will be the main mental approach.
Jim.
Jim Clark from Nuance Multimedia. Mr Timms, by definition, we hear a lot about the organisations and people that the ACCC doesn't like. Can you please share with us a business organisation and an individual whom you do admire?
Oh, I think I've got to take issue with the premise of the question. I think the ACCC does what it does in, I think, a professional, detached manner. Now, that often means that we do get headbutting because we may be taking enforcement action, or we may be dealing with a merger where a particular particularly mergers, chief executives are extremely good at focusing on things from their perspective and running their case very hard, and so we do end up headbutting against them. But from my point of view, there'll never be any personal emotion attached to that. It'll be a detached approach. So, look, I admire most businesses in Australia. You've heard me single out, I guess, some monopoly businesses, but that's just because I think they do need effective regulation, nothing against the businesses themselves. I probably know, or not long ago knew the chief executives of most of Australia's top 50 companies and have great admiration for all of them. So I'm not going to single any of them out. You never know what will happen tomorrow, but no, I've got great admiration for most of Australia, all of the Australian business leaders that I've come across, and I've mixed very closely with them over recent years.
Neil Wilson from the Herald Sun. Just thinking of the Metcash example, how do you decide how far to push a case in order to make your point? In that example, you've got a lot of people who say you've already had 2 decisions go against you, and to what use do you make use of the High Court and the Constitution?
Oh, look, let me just make one point. I think we've had one decision go against us, which was the Justice, the first instance decision to where we, Metcash upheld had its position upheld. Yes, of course, the judge took a particular view on the injunction issue, but I think what we've had so far is a first instance decision on the Metcash issue. We looked at that and took advice. We felt that there were some aspects of that decision that we had to challenge for 2 reasons. One is we thought that the errors were such that it was still the right thing to do, to be trying to get independent supermarkets to have an ability to buy their groceries off competitive organisations rather than just have only one organisation to rely on. And secondly, we felt the judge had made some approaches to wider issues that needed to be challenged. So there were 2 reasons for doing that. So it very much depends on the judgment that you're dealing with. And we looked at that judgment, we assessed it carefully, and we decided there were good reasons to appeal. So that's as far as it goes. We'll take it judgment by judgment.
Okay. Any more? Yes.
You mentioned the possibility of looking at misuse of market power in relation to supermarkets, I guess, promotion of their private label brands at the expense of proprietary brands. Can you expand on that? I mean, what sort of conduct would a supermarket have to engage in to, raise the prospect of serious scrutiny from the Commission? What are the issues?
Well, look, Jeff, I'm not going to get drawn into particular behaviour, but Section 46, the misuse of market power, it is appropriately, I think, a very complex provision because it's trying to sort out what is normal, combative market economy behaviour on the one hand and what is inappropriate behaviour on the other. And as you know, probably as well as anybody in the room, it's got particular prescribed behaviour that you can't engage in. Now, when you have a supermarket which is providing the vehicle through which goods are sold, and the supermarket is not only providing the space and facilities for the branded products but also for its own competing products, those are situations where the misuse of market power provisions can be triggered by a range of behaviour. And as I say, I don't want to pick particular aspects of behaviour, but I think it's something we need to keep an eye on because it is an important issue. It's an issue that does affect many people supplying goods to supermarkets and ultimately can affect consumers from supermarket stores.